Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline will never be built.
Tonight, Indigenous and non-Indigenous opposition to the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline denounced the government's support for big oil. Found innocent of second-degree murder as Saskatchewan court rules on the gun charges for Gerald Stanley.
Really nice, and it brings you back to your roots.
And chefs cook up a fire feast in the Yukon. Good evening, I'm Beverly Andrews. After a 2-week break, it was back to work in Ottawa for members of Parliament, and the Kinder Morgan pipeline dispute was on a lot of politicians' minds, especially after yesterday's meeting between Trudeau and the premiers of BC and Alberta. As Todd Lamoran reports, the issue dominated question period.
I want to ask my friend, just how far are they willing to go to run roughshod over Indigenous rights to do the work of a Texas-based oil company? Answer that.
The member knows that the Government of Canada has engaged in unprecedented consultation with Indigenous communities. Up and down the line, we know that 44 Indigenous communities have signed benefit agreements with Kinder Morgan.
Laura's point about consultations has been a popular theme. It was brought up by both Alberta Premier Rachel Notley and Prime Minister Trudeau yesterday.
What I would say is that, in fact, there has actually been quite a bit of consultation and engagement with Indigenous leaders.
It was with all that consultation done and with all that engagement done that we were able to approve that pipeline. That process did deeply involve Indigenous peoples.
However, in the foyer of the House today, Green Party leader Elizabeth May disputed the quality of those consultations.
If this is the best, that's pretty pathetic. Grand Chief Stuart Phillip of the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs and his whole executive stand firm that this project cannot go ahead and be considered consistent with respect for Indigenous rights under our Constitution, and certainly can't under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which this government purports to support.
At yesterday's meeting, BC Premier John Horgan said he was going to court to get a judicial review over whether his province has the jurisdiction to restrict the flow of bitumen.
I don't believe that it is in the best interests of the country to engage in esoteric jurisdictional debates for the purposes of harassing a project to death.
May says everyone is overlooking the other reality.
There are constitutionally enshrined rights of Indigenous peoples in this country. They are embedded in the Constitution. No legislation can say that federal jurisdiction over interprovincial pipelines is paramount to the extent that it dissolves the rights of Indigenous peoples. It does not.
However, one of the most common responses to opposition questions today was this.
That this project in the national interest will be built.
The Honourable
Todd Lamoran, APTN National News, Ottawa.
The fight over the controversial Trans Mountain Pipeline heated up in Vancouver today. Indigenous leaders and politicians from BC met there to give their take on the Prime Minister's statement over the weekend that the pipeline would be built. APTN's Tina House was there at the press conference, and she joins us now. Hi, Tina. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Can you tell us what happened today?
Well, we just left the press conference not too long ago, and we're here down at Kitts Beach with tankers in our background, which is literally going to be ground zero if this pipeline gets built. At the press conference today, there is a unanimous consensus that there will be absolutely no pipeline built, according to the Grand Chief, as well as the other political leaders on the panel, and also the politicians that joined them on the panel today. There's a number of things at hand, and certainly Mayor Corrigan sums it up very nicely in this next clip.
I'm embarrassed that our Prime Minister and a Premier of our province are kowtowing to an American multinational oil company. And one of the things you're learning here as media and as citizens is this is the influence that the oil lobby has had in the back rooms of government for decades. We are just now being able to see that influence in front of our very eyes. The reality is that these governments have quietly, behind the scenes, been approving what oil companies do without putting in the proper protections for our citizens or considering the long-term and generational impacts of the things that they are doing. There is no strategy. There is no national plan. This is simply obedience to the corporate will.
Tina, what do you think will happen next for those opposing the project?
Well, I think there's no question at all that will be civil disobedience right up and down this pipeline route. It literally runs over 1,000 kilometers, and what I heard today was there will be more actions up on Burnaby Mountain, more actions on the other First Nations that are opposed to this pipeline. And I think Bob Chamberlain also talks that this deadline proposed by Kinder Morgan of May 31st is just ridiculous for the governments to get their act in order. Obviously, they can't agree, as we've seen by this last weekend's meeting.
So when a company from the United States declares that May 31st is the drop deadline to go forward, this is an ultimatum to the Canadian government to run over and disregard the human rights of Aboriginal people in Canada. And I want to believe that Canadians find this unacceptable. This country has a rich profile of immigrants from many other places in the world that escaped human rights. And they've come to Canada believing that this is a just and fair society. And we cannot frame this in any less a way. And if the government can find the money and the legislative powers to push a pipeline through, my question is, why do they not put that same level of attention, effort, and resources into redefining this country for the proper place and space for First Nations people to have authority within the traditional lands that have been ours since time immemorial?
The Member of Parliament for Burnaby South was in attendance. He was also arrested while protesting recently at the Kinder Morgan tank farm. What did he have to say?
Well, he certainly talked that there's been some heavy-handed threats coming from Ottawa, including the potential for the Army to step in with those on the front lines. And so he's been fighting this tooth and nail since he is the representative for Burnaby South and lives literally right in the same area where the Kinder Morgan had a pipeline spill in 2007. There's a lot on the line for his constituents as well as himself.
The National Energy Board review process was deeply flawed, and it was not appropriate. The Prime Minister promised during the election that he would redo the process and make Kinder Morgan resubmit. He broke that promise, and he's moving ahead with this pipeline.
This was a press conference about the Indigenous opposition. What was the response from Grand Chief Stuart Phillips?
Well, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip always has a lot to say in regards to, 100% consent is needed for this project to go through, and he's quite positive that there is not 100% for this project to go through. So he's confident that this will indeed escalate into more standoffs on the front line for sure.
Had Trudeau followed through with his commitments, we would have rigorous environmental oversight processes in place. The whole issue of consultation is a red herring. It's a distraction, because in the post-Chilcotin era, the legal bar has been raised to consent, and there is no consent. The answer is still no. The Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline will never be built.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, Tina. It sounds like there's still a lot more discussions to go on.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
And we would like to hear what you have to say about this or any other story. Here's how to contact us. Send an email to news@aptn.ca, like our National News Facebook page, follow us on Twitter @APTN News, or go to our aptnnews.ca website. A group made up of 5 First Nations in northern Alberta said they want to either buy a stake in the Trans Mountain Pipeline or to partner up and build a separate line. The head of the Athabasca Tribal Council, Chief Alan Adam from the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, is known for fighting against oil expansion and gave tours of the tar sands to actors Leonardo DiCaprio and Jane Fonda. Adam says that he is tired of fighting pipeline development in the courts and says that he wants to see a 100% First Nation-owned pipeline.
There has to come a point in time when you're going to say, okay, enough is enough. But I won't support a pipeline if it's going to be given to Enbridge or Trans Mountain or Trans Canada or Kinder Morgan or anybody else other than the First Nation-owned pipeline. Let's start talking about ownership of a pipeline, and then we could start working with these environmental groups and put a good plan in place or construct a good pipeline that's going to be secure for the environment where everybody's going to be satisfied.
The organization that represents 5 Métis communities in Alberta also joined in the meeting with the Athabasca Tribal Council about becoming pipeline owners. The CEO of the McMurray Métis believes Métis in Alberta have a strong relationship with First Nations in the province. Bill Lutet also says whatever the outcome of the Trans Mountain pipeline, Métis and First Nations should own and build their own, which would give a major opportunity to participate in economic development.
It was a very positive meeting. It does show that we are united up here still. Many of us, we've made our living, and retired from, Syncrudes and Suncors, and in my case, Trans-Canada pipelines.
The Quebec inquiry into Indigenous relations continues. Testimony heard today indicates the medical service provided to Indigenous people has a lot of room for improvement. We'll hear more on that after the break, but first, let's take a look at tomorrow's weather outlook. Cloudy in much of the Maritimes, plus 10 in Fredericton, plus 11 in Halifax, both with rain. 0 and sunny in Cartwright. Kuujjuaq also sunny and -2. Lots of cloud in Quebec, plus 1 in Chibougamau, plus 4 in Val-d'Or. Sault Ste. Marie has cloud cover and plus 3. Ottawa is cloudy and plus 4. Kappa-Casing and Wawa, cloudy and plus 1. In sunny Manitoba, Churchill is 1, Norway House plus 5. Dauphin is plus 5, Brandon has some cloud and plus 3. North Battleford is cloudy and plus 4. Saskatoon and Estevan also plus 4 with some rain. Cloudy and plus 3 in Uranium City, Buffalo Narrows, La Ronge, and Meadow Lake. Monday, the Quebec inquiry into Indigenous relations heard from members from the Algonquin Nation. Their testimony added to what has become a growing course of discontent towards the hospital in Val-d'Or, Quebec. Tom Fenario brings us this story.
Je suis une humaine comme tout le monde. J'ai le droit au même service aussi.
This morning's first testimony came from Jacqueline Michel. From nearby Lac-Simon First Nation, the Algonquin woman testified that when her sister Helene died in the Val-d'Or hospital, a nurse prevented Jacqueline from seeing her. The reason? Visitor hours had just ended.
Il n'a pas respecté notre coutume. Notre coutume, nous autres, c'est d'être à côté d'une personne qui t'avait de mourir, de rester.
Further adding to Michelle's frustration was that a doctor had given her permission to see her sister before the nurse stopped her. Jimmy Papatsy also had a bad experience with a nurse at the Val-d'Or hospital. The Algonquin man from Kitsiakik First Nation had been diagnosed with liver stones. A doctor wrote in his chart that when the stones started to pass, he would need an operation. But when Papatsy showed up in emergency in extreme pain, he said a nurse refused to look in his chart when he told her about the stones. Instead, she asked him if he had been drinking or using drugs.
Entre le temps, j'ai rentré à l'hôpital pour des pierres au foie malgré mon insistance qu'on regarde mon dossier et s'est déroulé 14 heures. 14 heures avec une pierre au foie qui est active, fait très mal, je ne souhaite pas ça à personne. Ça a été une expérience traumatisante pour moi de voir qu'une infirmière avait autant de pouvoir de décider si j'allais vivre ou j'allais mourir. C'est comme ça que moi je l'ai regardé.
Admets-le qu'il y a un cancer dans ta ville. Il y a un cancer qui mène à la violence.
Papetit has long been vocal about what he says is a culture of racism in Val-d'Or. He says public services in the city need to get educated on Indigenous realities.
Il devrait avoir une formation obligatoire, mais faite par du monde de chez nous, avec notre version à nous. On ne va pas demander à un anthropologue ou qui que ce soit d'aller parler pour nous, là.
Quebec inquiry hearings will continue in Val-d'Or until the end of the week. Then in May, they'll be heading to Maniottenam First Nation. Tom Thanario, APTN National News, Montreal.
The man whose acquittal in the shooting death of a young Indigenous man, which drew national attention, has pleaded guilty to charge of improperly storing firearms. Gerald Stanley was back in a Saskatchewan court today, 2 months after he was found not guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Colton Bushy. The judge accepted a joint submission that will see Stanley pay close to $4,000. He will be banned from owning guns for 10 years and must forfeit any firearms. As a part of Yukon's Culinary Festival, top Indigenous chefs from across the nation showcased their culinary skills to highlight Canadian cuisine. Sheila McLean tells us more about the first ever Fire Feast.
A perfect day for a Yukon campfire cookout. But what's on the grill isn't your average ingredients for a wiener roast. It's a fire feast. Today's menu includes cedar plank maple glazed Arctic char, smelts wrapped in kelp, salted bison roast, and seal loin marinated in mint are some of the dishes being sizzled by some of the nation's top Indigenous chefs.
It's really nice, and it brings you back to your roots and the humble beginnings.
The chefs were handpicked by Eric Bateman of Edible Canada. His company runs tours across the world that showcases Canadian cuisine.
It's local, seasonal, sustainable ingredients in the hands of many cultures. And Canada being a cultural melting pot, there's hundreds and hundreds of cultures, but the reality is the foundation culture, the original culture of Canada is the Indigenous peoples.
Precious cargo,
The idea behind the Fire Feast is to showcase Indigenous cuisine, but to also include local culinary students to help prepare the food.
Just different techniques and methods, what they cook and how they bread, like stuff, learning different stuff. Like I've never tried seal. There's going to be seal there today, so it'll be kind of interesting.
Classically trained in French cuisine, Joseph Shawana is the chef and owner of Cookham Indigenous Kitchen in Toronto. Last fall, Shawana faced international backlash for serving the highly controversial meat, but says he did his due diligence in finding seal that is sustainably harvested. He serves it to pay homage to the northern communities.
They eat it and it sustained them for thousands of years, right? So then it's one of the most controversial meats in Canada, or I guess in the world.
Chef Shane Chartrand, a CHOP Canada alumni and executive chef of Sage Restaurant in Edmonton, was looking for ooligan, but settled for smelts.
We're wrapping them in barbecue Swiss chard with a little bit of a white turnip puree, some like powdered seaweed, and a little bit of birch syrup, like birch barbecue sauce. It's gonna be like a little roll-up.
Owner of Feast Cafe Bistro in Winnipeg, Chef Krista Bruno Gunther has brought some ingredients from home.
It's the most beautiful wild rice that I've ever seen, so I had to bring a little bit of home here for this collaboration and for this fire feast. So I'm going to and this is actually going into my wild rice, blueberry, and corn salad, the Arctic char. So you just boil it just like pasta.
Dinner guests watch as the unique dishes are prepared over the fire pit on the shores of Nares Lake at the Carcross-Tagish First Nation Cultural Center.
Fire just adds flavor to food. Like it's fun, it's flavorful, it's unique, and obviously it's culturally appropriate. So that's why we wanted to come out and play around. And we've got this great big fire pit here, and again, all the chefs love to play in the fire.
And without a hitch, the chefs and their teams have prepared a culinary spread with their signature dishes along with other Indigenous-inspired foods.
Well, I've just had the first bite ever of seal. That is the most amazing piece of meat. I love the way it feels within my teeth, like it has a different bite. and it's delicious. It's delicious.
Well done. I don't know that I've had Arctic char done quite as good as this.
The chefs say their creations are a way to educate and connect people to their stories, and it's a creative way to preserve Indigenous culture and history. Shirley McLean, APTN National News, Carcross, Yukon.
That all looked delicious. Weather has caused some huge disruptions in many areas over the weekend. We'll take a look at that after the break. But right now, we'll look at the rest of tomorrow's weather outlook in your area. +2 in cloudy in Peace River and Grand Prairie. More cloud in Edmonton and +3. Calgary also +3 with rain. Vancouver, Victoria and Penticton all +11 and cloudy. Smithers is partly cloudy and +9. Prince George is also partly cloudy and +5. Sunny and 0 in Beaver Creek, more sun in Rock River and -9. Trout Lake and Wrigley has some cloud cover and -2. Sunny and a cool -13 in Sax Harbor, sunny and -10 in Fort McPherson. -10 with sun in Baker Lake. Arviette is also sunny and -2. Cloud in Cape Dorset and -5. Talayuk, partly cloudy and -18. Hawaii wasn't spared from the harsh weather with massive rainstorms causing huge flooding. This is a shot over Hanalei Bay, where dozens, including tourists, are stranded at a Red Cross shelter after a storm dumped over 2 feet of rain. Hawaii Governor David Ihiji issued an emergency proclamation for the island where heavy rainfall has damaged or flooded homes. The National Weather Service recorded some 680 milliliters of rain in just 24 hours. In Toronto, the temperature has drifted above freezing, and that's causing chunks of ice to fly off Canada's tallest building, the CN Tower.
Look at that. You saw that? You caught that one? Unbelievable.
One of the chunks has also apparently punctured the roof of the adjacent Rogers Centre. They've also been dropping onto walkways and to pedestrian bridges around the towers. And that is your APTN National News for Monday. Stay with us for an encore presentation of APTN Investigates Reckoning at St. Anne's, a look at a notorious residential school in Northern Ontario. See you back here tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening.